Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the great state of Mississippi is Dr. Robert Colby. He's an associate professor at Ole Miss, and we're going to talk today about his excellent book, An Unholy Traffic, the Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
So now, did I say Mississippi correctly? I got to make sure I get it in
Uh,
as few syllables as possible, I think.
as someone who is not a native Mississippian, I do not have a strong opinion about this.
So, the book, which is available from Oxford University Press, just an excellent examination of a portion of the slave trade that most people forget about. You say in your introduction that it's kind of like a natural breaking point in the study of slavery is Fort Sumter. If people are looking at slavery and capitalism and King Cotton,
Mhm.
Fort Sumter's kind of a death knell to that popular narrative. But you're suggesting, wait a second, there's a lot more we need to get into here.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really that I think helps kind of drive that, right, is that like you said, there have been some wonderful books on the domestic slave trade, the trade in enslaved people within the United States, which is practiced really widely in the first half of the 19th century, in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Slave traders move at least 500,000 people between the upper South and the lower South, possibly several 100,000 more than that. So you have this really thriving business in people that exists leading up to the Civil War. And there's been some really great work done on that. Books by Walter Johnson, Joshua Rothman, among many, many others. But those books take sort of as their primary focus the connections between the slave trade and the emergence of cotton in the United States, the connections between slavery and American economic development in the first half of the 19th century. And the Civil War moves away from those connections. As we know as Civil War historians, Civil War reorders aspects of the American economy. It's often seen as sort of this hinge point between sort of the agrarian America that exists before and the industrializing nation that comes beyond. So there's all kinds of point of rupture. And of course, when we talk about slavery and the Civil War, we mostly talk about emancipation. We don't talk about the survival of the institution of slavery during the Civil War. And so the studies of the slave trade that exists mostly don't go into the Civil War period, and most historians of the Civil War don't really look backward and look for sort of the survival of this business. And so it was something that as I was doing research as a young graduate student, that really jumped out at me as I encountered it more and more in the archives and the origins of this book are in trying to explain things that I was seeing in Civil War letters, diaries, military documents that really felt like they shouldn't be happening. Transactions in enslaved people that didn't make sense from the perspective of someone studying the Civil War 160 years later, or 150 then. Um, uh, and that's really where this book comes from.
Well, and you talk about, you actually use the word mosaic as you try to piece together this evidentiary trail that didn't make sense. And what's the picture it's revealing as you piece it together? And I'm assuming the book is the result of kind of looking at that mosaic.
Yeah, it really is. And I will just say that I think one of the other reasons that this book didn't exist before, that no one had already written this book. I make no particular claims to sort of brilliance, but what I will make claims to is persistence. In looking through Civil War records, there aren't that many collections, for example, of Civil War letters that focus primarily on the slave trade. There are a handful that have significant numbers of documents. There's basically collections of what are functionally slave traders' incoming correspondence scattered around the country, but those are pretty few and far between. What I found instead is that while the slave trade isn't the primary focus of most participants in the Civil War, it shows up over and over and over again, and almost everyone who spends time in the wartime South encounters it in some way, shape, or form. Whether that's a Confederate soldier discussing with his wife how are they going to confront the challenge inflation poses for people living on the home front, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but one answer to that is to sell human property. Or whether that's a Union soldier, on picket duty who encounters a fugitive from slavery coming into Union lines, motivated by the fact that he or she expected to be sold. It's not the primary focus of most people's experiences during the Civil War. But what was striking to me in doing this research is the degree to which it is everywhere.
Mhm.
Once you start looking, once you start pulling on that thread, it takes you through all kinds of different collections. People wrote to Lincoln suggesting that one of the best ways to end the Civil War was to crack down on the domestic slave trade. Just as an example, it's everywhere once you start looking for it, but it's not prominently featured in most people's recollections of the Civil War.
And I think too, maybe we suffer from a little bit of amnesia about it because we know how the war ends, and the war
Hmm.
ends slavery. And so, gosh, the
Hmm.
war starts and it's going to end slavery. And we talk about emancipation, as you said, but we forget like the Confederacy thinks it's a going concern.
Hmm.
When the war starts, like we're going to continue on, and we've got this way of life. We've enshrined this institution in our very Constitution, and so it's business as usual on a day-to-day level in many ways throughout the South.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I would say that the degree to which that remains true in so much of the Confederacy is one of the things that I should have sort of known heading into the project, right? I studied as an undergraduate with Gary Gallagher.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Gary Gallagher hammered into his students is that you have to read the Civil War going forward. You can't sit in your perch in 2025 knowing, that the Civil War is going to end in April 1865 and, interpret things through that lens because people didn't know that was going to happen, right? Which seems like an obvious conclusion, but in researching and writing this book, I caught myself repeatedly, working from the assumption that I knew what was going to happen in the Civil War and forgetting the people I was reading didn't. And this is such a good example of that. We talk about emancipation during the Civil War, and emancipation is absolutely a critical part of the Civil War. The Civil War has the military conflict, the presence particularly of Union soldiers has a hugely corrosive effect on the institution of slavery. But the reality is that when we talk about emancipation, only and the estimates vary, but at a low end 400,000 and at the high end 800,000 enslaved people actually win free of bondage during the war itself. That represents somewhere between 12 and 20% of the people enslaved in the United States in 1860, which means that the reality is that probably at least 80% of the people who were enslaved at the beginning of the war remain enslaved when the war is over, and their experience of the war is fundamentally shaped by the survival of the institution of slavery up to and including the trade in the enslaved. And so I think it's not that's not to downplay. It's um, not to suggest in any way that the Civil War does not, destroy slavery, does not produce emancipation. But I think what it does force us to do is to think about how and why and sort of at what pace that plays out in the lives of people enslaved in the American South.
Now, you have what I think is a really important insight and maybe sort of frame for the whole book that you write in your introduction. Let me quote you here. Understanding the long-term pain and trauma the wartime domestic slave trade inflicted upon African Americans is essential to ongoing reassessments of the Civil War's human costs. That's a big statement, and I think a good purpose statement for your book. And I think it may be a really important way for us to ground our conversation today. Like, this is why it's really important for us to talk about this particular aspect, even though it's been so forgotten about.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, one of the things that Civil War historians I think have done a really good job of in the last of 10, 15 years is really rooting ourselves in the war and the like you said, the human costs of the Civil War, whether that's sort of the reassessments of the number of the death toll of the war that we've seen, sort of the ongoing debate over how many people actually died in the war, whether that's a lot of the really good focus on veterans that's taken place. I'm thinking, about Brian Matthew Jordan's work, Jim Martin's, so many other people. In fact, I was one of the sort of moments that was really helpful to me in framing this is Brian Matthew Jordan has an essay in a collection about the hour that lasted 50 years, talking about the Ohio regiment he's studying's experiences at Gettysburg and how for the both the physical wounds that men suffered on those days, the losses to a community, but also the ways in which those men were wrestling with the memory of that lasted for generations after the Civil War. And I think thinking about the wartime slave trade and the ways in which African Americans won free of slavery during the Civil War requires sort of that similar long-term perspective. One of the places this shows through most clearly is Judy Giesberg at Villanova is heads up this project called Last Seen, where they're digitizing and making publicly available advertisements African Americans placed looking for family members in the aftermath of the Civil War. And some of them don't have to do with the Civil War. Some of them have to do with sort of general migration and things like that. But so many of them are rooted in separations that took place either before or during the Civil War. Whether that's because an army swept through, or in many cases because um, enslavers sold people during the Civil War. And so you see 10, 15, 20, 30, even 40 years after the Civil War, you still see people who had once been enslaved looking for family members who they'd lost. And, I think one of the things that I hope we think about with through my book and through the work of so many other people is just that that's part of the story of the Civil War. Um, that pursuit of freedom doesn't just sort of begin and end in the Reconstruction years, but it continues and it lasts and it persists and it shapes people's lives well after the guns have fallen silent.
And you think about like today, how many people are interested in genealogy, and so kind of what you're talking about here in the immediate aftermath of the war for those next decades is people trying to find who are they, what are their roots,
Hmm.
what are their identities, and the challenges that must have existed for those people to find those questions, which is, I think, a very basic human sort of question: Who am I? Where did I come from? That I mean, and that's got to be traumatizing to know that just whole parts of your past have been uprooted through beyond any means of your own, without
Hmm.
your consent, the consent of the people around you. It's just all been uprooted, and you have to try to sort through that mess. Wow.
Yeah. Some of the most powerful documents I came across in doing this research were in the Freedmen's Bureau, which, thanks to some of the digitization work that's going on, are becoming more and more available. But so there's the psychological element to it, but there's also it's really material. You see, one of the things the Freedmen's Bureau did was to make efforts to reunite African American families that had been separated either by sale or by the war. And what you see all these petitions to the Bureau, all these letters from African Americans, or all these moments when African Americans walked into Bureau offices and they said, "Look, can you find my children?" Because maybe the parents are elderly and can't support themselves and they need material support from family members, or they are looking for family members who they know were sick when they were sold away and they want to support them. And so there are just so many layers to this, whether psychological, whether political, whether material. And yeah, I think that when we think about the Civil War, we need to weigh all of that in sort of the balance that emerges from the conflict, and it also that shapes the way that people remember and continue to think about the content the Civil War decades after its conclusion.
And this sort of reminds me of some of the material you write about in your afterword, where you talk about that effort by enslavers to separate themselves from the act of enslavement. And so slavery as an institution sort of becomes more abstract, less human, removed from the people.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that sets the topic forward on a trajectory that still exists today, where we think of slavery sort of as this abstract thing and forget that, well, yeah, okay, maybe they were enslaved people, but like, the sorts of things you're talking about, like where I got to find my family, or
Yeah.
um, I think it makes it hard for us to talk about slavery in a way that really kind of gets at the heart of what slavery really was and did.
And you're right. Like this, and Robert Goodmestad has written some really great stuff about beginning even before the Civil War, slaveholders' efforts to distance themselves from the slave trade, right? That they recognized that there was something uniquely abhorrent, or that the slave trade provided a particularly potent weapon for abolitionists. And so the effort to distinguish between someone who owned slaves and someone who bought and sold slaves begins in the antebellum period leading up to the Civil War, and continues into the aftermath of the Civil War. There's slave traders largely fade into obscurity. Very few people are sort of willing to own up to having been a slave trader, although they surface periodically. And there is a remarkable amount of forgetting that takes place, and not least as sort of the urban landscapes of major southern cities change as well. I think about I do a lot of my research focuses on Richmond, and it's hard to prove, but I have to imagine one of the reasons that we don't remember the slave trade is because most of Richmond's slave trading district was literally paved over,
Right.
to when the predecessors of what's now Interstate 95 ran through the city. And so there are, it's not that there are none, but there are relatively few um, physical remnants of the slave trade that survive, and so it disappears into plain sight in many cases in the late 19th century, or is completely destroyed by industrialization, and various sort of projects in southern cities. I mean, if you drive on I-95 through Richmond, you literally drive straight over the heart of Richmond's slave trading district. Uh, there are a handful of sites that you can still see, but there's very little, and I think that really aids in the forgetting of the slave trade in a way that we I haven't thought a great deal about this, right? But there's sort of a it's sort of the inverse of the survival of large plantation houses, and the ways in which those sort of make slavery
Oh,
more
yeah.
seem more genteel in the late 19th century. But whereas the physical remnants of the slave trade are disappear fairly quickly.
Yeah. I mean, really, you're articulating the very argument I always make about battlefield preservation. Like, you've got to
Hmm.
have the ground in order to
Hmm.
be able to interpret it and carry on that story. And when you lose the ground, you lose the most tangible reminder you have for telling that story, and
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're ever in Alexandria, Virginia, Alexandria has one of the surviving portions of a slave trading facility, survived the Freedom House Museum, just as an example. And you can go into a basement of a slave trading facility, and it's a very powerful place. Hopefully there will be the opportunity to preserve or to highlight in urban settings, particularly. The fact that some of these places still do exist, we just don't recognize them for what they were.
Right. Now, you mentioned a lot of your research focuses on Richmond. You start your book telling the story of Richard Lumpkin, and every time I was reading his name, I kept thinking of Fatty Lumpkin from Lord of the Rings. I apologize, but it's like in the closing days of the Petersburg Richmond campaign, and he's still engaged in the slave trade and trying to save it, even as the Union Army is closing in. It was a really dramatic starting point, even though it's kind of near the very, very end of
Hmm.
the war. Why'd that capture your imagination?
Yeah, it captured my imaginations for another thing, and I will completely confess that I know that there's a huge difference between Robert Lumpkin and Tom Bombadil's pony, right? This
I
is
couldn't keep making that
if
distinction.
emerging Civil War were not nerdy enough for you already, we've crossed a line. But so I will say this struck me for a couple of moments. One, it is one of the few places where the wartime slave trade does break through in the sense that it's not as if I'm the first person to talk about this moment where Robert Lumpkin is trying to move people out of the city's slave jails. This has shown up in histories of Richmond during the Civil War of of a number of Civil War history. You know, Leon Litwack, going back decades, right? So this is a well known story in a way, but it's usually presented sort of largely devoid of the context, or it's presented as look at this sort of last gasp, this last sort of mad gasp of slavery right before everything comes crashing down, right? It's presented as sort of a coda, and what it when I came across it several times, and I thought, but why is he doing this? Why is it worth Robert Lumpkin's trouble? Robert Lumpkin, I should note, ran a had been in the slave trade in some way, shape, or form for like 30 years by the end of the Civil War. He ran a jail complex in Richmond. It You can actually visit sort of a corner of his complex. If Most of it is, as I've said, under I-95, but portions of it are still visible. It's an incredibly powerful site. You have to wind through a bunch of one-way streets to get there, but you can visit it. But so why is he bothering? And the story that Chris is referring to is that, as the day that Confederates in Richmond get word that Lee is pulling out of Petersburg, the city is going to fall, as government operatives are running around loading records, loading money, loading government officials onto trains out of the city. Robert Lumpkin, who runs this slave jail, makes his way to one of the railroad depots and tries his darndest to get 50 enslaved people on one of the trains heading out of the city.
And
And
not to help him escape.
no, right,
No.
so that he can keep them in slavery. And there's probably a liability aspect to this. He probably doesn't want to be liable for for losing people whom he was jailing for someone else. But what stood out to me was, one, we haven't thought about why he thinks this is worth his while. And the other thing that's striking is he's not the only one who's doing stuff like this. Um, I found a couple of examples of Confederate soldiers on the retreat to Appomattox buying and selling people. I found references to slave traders in other cities who are buying people right on the verge of Appomattox. And what that pointed to me is that they're doing something that presumably makes sense in their mind. And the project really grew out of a need to make sense for why this is still happening in what we know to be the last days of the Civil War. And so it really I use it to introduce the book, but I do that because it really hooked my imagination, or it hooked my curiosity as I was getting into the research, and it led me in many ways into um, realizing that Robert Lumpkin is far from alone in continuing to try to deal in people during the Civil War. And then the question, of course, becomes why? Why would Confederates of so many different stripes in so many different places with so many different experiences of the conflict, excuse me, why would they make positive, sometimes by that I mean active, make active and often concerted and extensive efforts to acquire enslaved people during the war?
Now, you start the book with that story, but then from there you flash back to sort of give us a sort of a picture of here's what the slave trade looked like
Mhm.
nationally, heading into the war. You've got some great maps that are great infographics in this book, by the way. I'm a big map nerd, and your
Mhm.
maps are fantastic. Um, but from there, then you talk really about some topics that a lot of people maybe forget about, like the recession of 1860 has an
Mhm.
impact on the slave trade. Secession itself has an impact on the slave trade. Tell us a little bit about those sorts of factors that influence things right in the eve of the war.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the slave trade had been big business for most of the 19th century. In fact, it's really, if not at its absolute peak, it's approaching another apex in the late 1850s and 1860. Um, and it continues pretty much unabated right up until the weeks before Abraham Lincoln is elected president. One of the things that I think is sort of striking is that at least into the summer of 1860, the political turmoil has relatively little effect on the slave trade. In fact, if you look at the correspondence of slave traders, they are far more worried about climate conditions. There'd been a drought in the years leading up, and actually they're worried that there's kind of a bubble, what we would call a bubble mounting in enslaved property. And what secession does is it really punctures this bubble. But what I found really striking in doing the research is it doesn't do it for the reasons that we would think, right? We think, okay, Lincoln is elected. We know that Lincoln's election provokes secession because white Southerners are afraid of what his election will mean for the future of slavery, and they want to move while they feel like they have an opportunity to do so. But as you mentioned, what actually punctures sort of the bubble of the slave trade has much less to do with how white Southerners feel about slavery's future, and much more to do with the sort of nuts and bolts that ground how this business gets done. We really don't. This is a completely this I will say could go in a lot of different directions, but we really don't talk about the degree to which secession was an economic crisis in and of itself. Because the economy is a national phenomenon. You have financial links binding New Orleans and New York, binding the Lower Mississippi Valley and Chicago. You have lines of credit. You have people invested in railroads that are tied to one another, right? The United States has truly a national economy in 1860, and when you know physically half of the country, and a third of its population is trying to withdraw from that, it creates an incredible amount of turmoil. And so you have people who essentially, I mean, if you wanted to boil it down, the big concern at everybody, the big thing everyone's wondering in 1860 is, okay, so and so owes me money. Am I going to get paid? And that fear makes them in turn reluctant to loan money to anybody else. And so what you have is all of the credit essentially evaporates from the economy. And not to put like too fine a point on it, but that makes it really difficult to buy anything, particularly in the South, but much particularly enslaved people, who are incredibly expensive. It takes a significant amount of credit, and a significant financial outlay to acquire a person. The number fluctuates depending on which calculator you use, but an enslaved person in 1860 would be valued at anywhere from $700 to $1,200 as a general rule. In our current terms, that is, if you're talking about an average, we're talking about $30,000 for an enslaved person. I've seen some calculators that put that much higher. So enslaved people are incredibly valuable. Enslaved people, I should say, are the second most valuable thing in the United States when the Civil War begins. The only thing that's worth more than enslaved people is land when the Civil War begins. And so, yeah, there's this incredible financial crisis, and I was really surprised when I got into the research to find how much that dominated people's perspectives on all sorts of economic questions, but including the slave market in the winter and spring of 1860 to 61. So yeah, it was something I would love to see more people sort of dig into that. We don't think about it enough, I think. But what the real thing that I took away from that is that, okay, yeah, there are certainly people who are concerned about slavery's future and what it'll mean, but not as much as I would have expected. And this sort of short-term financial problem, again, with the nuts and bolts of the economy, looms much larger in their minds than whatever they think Abraham Lincoln might do.
And as the war goes on, slavery has such an important macro and micro effect on economics.
Mhm.
As the nation state of the Confederacy, it's certainly really important to kind of keep infrastructure going and such. But then, like for families where their family income is invested in the enslaved people it owns. So as the economy shifts over the course of the war, what does that do to the slave trade?
Yeah, it does a lot of things. And one of the things that I think I took away from research and writing this book is that the slave trade and the flexibility that it offers people, like the ability to turn people into cash, really manifests itself, really shows up in significant ways during the Civil War because the Civil War puts incredible economic pressure on virtually everybody living in the Confederacy. And arguably the entire South, right? And so, we could talk. This goes in a number of different directions. And so, one of the core things I think, one of the core cases I make in my book is that, yeah, the Civil War is an incredibly diverse experience. But one of the through lines of that diversity is that as white Southerners and Confederates particularly adapt to their circumstances, one of the major ways that they adapt to it is by buying and selling people. So you have, for example, we could talk about a number of things, but just as an example, uh, by the end of the Civil War, 80% of the military-aged white men in the Confederacy are in the military. And most of those who aren't are serving in some other sort of essential war-related function, which means, and yet, uh, the Confederacy still needs to bring in the harvest. It still needs to produce all of the things required to fight an increasingly modern war. And so there's a labor deficit that gets filled in large part by the recruitment and deployment of enslaved men and women. And as more and more people are sort of clamoring for that labor, one of the ways that families, but also industrial firms, make sure that they have the workforce that they need is by buying enslaved people. So whether it's a family farm that all of a sudden, has to compensate for multiple sons who are in the Confederate Army, that family might go out and buy people to replace that work, the labor that they provided. Similarly, to go back to Richmond as an example, the Tredegar Iron Works, which now houses the American Civil War Museum. Tredegar had always used enslaved labor. They had always hired 40 to 50 to 60 enslaved people per year. During the Civil War, Tredegar has up to 800 enslaved laborers working there, most of whom they hire or rent essentially from slaveholders, but many of whom, again, especially as this competition gets fierce, many of whom they buy outright during the war to make sure that they have the specific workers or laborers that they need. And so, but this challenge, replicates itself all across the Confederacy in all sorts of different ways, shapes, and forms. So you have, on the flip side of this, you have families that might become refugees as the Union Army moves through their territory, their area. Many of those people will sell enslaved people whom they believe they can't feed or control anymore. Many people will find that food is running short or that impressment has left them shorthanded, and they answer by selling people. And so there's all kinds of ways in which the crises that the Civil War produces at sort of a macro, but also at a deeply personal level, that produces or spurs white Southerners to engage in the slave trade.
And you mentioned the ironworks in Richmond, and the South basically has to create this huge
Hmm.
industrialization from scratch, throughout most of its territory. So it's this forced, fast industrialization that you talk about in the
Hmm.
book that we need labor forces to kind of help make that happen. And so that's
Yeah.
that's almost like a new infusement of or a new infusion of a type of need for enslaved work that hadn't existed
Hmm.
before.
Yeah, I mean it's the kind of thing where it's what's interesting is that yeah, enslaved labor there had been enslaved labor in Southern industries since for decades. But those industries had been such a marginal part of the Southern economy prior to the Civil War, outside of a few places in Appalachia or in, the Upper South in St. Louis or Kentucky or Virginia. But what the Civil War really does is it puts all of that on steroids. And so, and essentially anywhere that there's an industrial operation in the South, in the wartime South, you're going to find enslaved laborers working there. And I will say that again for I would say the preponderance of the enslaved people working in those capacities, railroads, iron foundries, coal mines, are rented by those entities. But especially where the work is dangerous, or especially where circumstances require particularly tight control, what you see is those firms going out and trying to buy enslaved laborers outright. Coal mines are a really good example of this. Coal mining is incredibly dangerous. And enslaved people really don't like doing it, so individual slaveholders are much less likely to rent an enslaved person to a coal mine, so coal mines often have to go out and buy the people who work there. But this extends all throughout the economy. A surprising number of enslaved people are engaged in making salt uh, for the Confederacy. Right there, we it's something we don't think about from 2020, but salt is incredibly important. It's Ella Lon's classic book on salt in the Confederacy from the 30s. Right, but enslaved people are critical parts of that, and many of the people working at salt works are bought outright. Excuse me, are bought outright to work there. I mean, and again, the larger point here, right, is that once you start looking for it, the slave trade is absolutely everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. I'll just say one other thing. If you look at Civil War newspapers, you will see an incredible number of ads for fugitive slaves. Um, and one of the things that it's not universal, but it's pretty frequent in these ads is that the ad will note that the person who fled had been bought or sold recently. And so there's an incredible amount of movement, efforts to redistribute and control labor in the Confederacy, and a lot of that is done through the slave trade. The slave trade also inspires many people to seize their freedom and to flee during the Civil War. So there's a lot going on, and it's a really complicated picture. But my larger point is that it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
everywhere once you start looking for it.
I think of instances where either like a Confederate army had to impress slaves to help with fortifications or labor,
Hmm.
or the Confederate or state governments had to impress enslaved labor to do that. As inflation becomes a problem across the South as the war goes on, does the slave trade and those sorts of instances where the government or the armies need the slaves, does that make the inflation worse? Does the inflation make it harder to get that kind of labor? I can see sort of a self-perpetuating downward spiral out of all of that.
Yeah, I would say it's something that cuts in a lot of different directions. So I'll sort of highlight three things that I think three ways that this and they're in tension with one another, and that's one of the things that makes it hard to say there's not just one story going on here.
Right.
So the slave trade interacts with inflation in a couple of different ways. One, inflation makes it makes it harder and harder to do business in anything, including enslaved people, because money and paper currency particular becomes an unreliable medium of exchange. So you see examples in Confederate newspapers of business people of all kinds refusing to take money in exchange for goods. That is to some degree true of enslaved people, right? Uh, Enslaved people as an asset, I would say, are much better, are much more reliable. Confederates have a higher confidence in ownership of an enslaved person than they do in ownership of Confederate money. Confederates are pretty convinced that even well, I will say this: there's not a direct relationship, I don't think, between Confederate confidence in their victory and the value of Confederate money. You see Confederates all the time saying, "Well, look, even if we win, everyone knows that the Confederate government is still going to repudiate its debt and repudiate its currency, right? So even if we win, this money's not going to be worth anything. And they look at the revolutionary United States as an example of this. They say, look, we won our revolution, but everyone knows a continental dollar is still a byword for something worthless. Um, so in some ways, it makes trading and enslaved people very difficult. And there's a bunch of letters from Richmond in 1864, for example, when inflation is just getting out of control, where people say, look, all business is just ground to a standstill. The two other ways that I will say that this cuts, one has to do with that does incentivize people, if they can, to acquire enslaved people, because enslaved people will have value when the war is over, they believe, even if money won't. And so there is a great deal of speculation in enslaved people on the logic that that it's something that will be valuable when the war is done. And if Confederate money is not going to be worth anything, win or lose, you can Confederates see enslaved people as something that will be valuable and very valuable if they win. And I would say the sort of the third thing is that yeah, to your point about sort of conscripting and acquiring enslaved laborers, I do think it matters. It does. I think where this intersects is I think it matters for how uh, deeply and how much Confederates want to hold on to enslaved laborers as much as they can. There's a great deal of reluctance to uh, give enslaved laborers over to these sorts of projects. Confederates complain about it all the time, and it inspires the purchase and sale of enslaved people, as so many other aspects of the Civil War do. So Charles Dew, in his book on Buffalo Forge, which is this iron foundry in the Shenandoah Valley, tells the story of the forge responding to the Confederate government's call for enslaved laborers to build fortifications around Richmond. And so the forge is going to have to supply laborers to meet the Confederate government's demands. But the operators essentially say, well, we can't afford to send skilled workers who are critical to our business. So what they do instead is they turn to the slave trade. They buy two men through a local slave trader. They send those two men to work on fortifications around Richmond. And then when the Confederate government releases those laborers, the forge's operators turn right around and they sell those two men back into the slave trade, essentially. And so what I think what I think we see here again is the Civil War is so complicated. It's such a big animal that manifests in so many different ways in people's lives. But the slave trade, excuse me, provides this through line where the flexibility of being able to sell people or buy people allows Confederates particularly, but white Southerners as a whole, to adapt to the different circumstances or their different understandings of their circumstances during the war.
Hey, you talk in the book about how the Emancipation Proclamation impacts the slave trade. It's an aspect that most people don't pay attention to. They sort of talk about who is or isn't freed, but there's a whole economy that's still booming and bustling underneath all of this. Tell us just a little bit about the impact that the EP has on the slave trade.
Yeah, it's the Emancipation Proclamation's effect is really interesting in some ways, in the sense that, right, so if historians uh, drawing on arguments made during the Civil War argue about whether the Emancipation Proclamation matters at all, right? There are people who say the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't mean anything, it doesn't actually free any enslaved people at all. And you can certainly find that borne out in the slave trade and the Emancipation Proclamation, in the sense that what Confederates basically say, well, okay, this piece of paper says enslaved people are free now, but Abraham Lincoln's all the way over there, and it doesn't matter because it doesn't apply here, right? And so, one of the things that really surprised me when I was doing my research is in both private correspondence and in the press, what you see is Confederates saying the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't matter, and we'll prove it to you, because look at how many enslaved people are selling in city X, and look at the prices that they're selling for. They wouldn't be going for those prices. They wouldn't be selling at all if people were at all scared of Lincoln's proclamation. And so, on one level, the looking at the slave trade does sort of reflect the fact that yes, the Emancipation Proclamation is in many ways aspirational. Right? It only applies. Uh, it only applies in sort of a theoretical way, and it doesn't apply until the Union Army is present to put it into effect. On the other hand, there are a handful of examples of places where you see that yes, the Emancipation Proclamation really does matter. I think I don't actually. This didn't actually make it really into the book, or if it did, only briefly. I think about I came across in my research. There was a county in Kentucky that was holding an auction of enslaved people. And Ambrose Burnside, or one of his subordinates as commander of the Department of the Ohio, sort of stepped in and said, "No, no, no, this can't happen." Um, and there's sort of a back and forth between local authorities and the Union Army, and it eventually makes its way up to Lincoln. And Lincoln's response is, "Well, yeah, Burnside was right to shut this down, because who knows if the people that this Kentucky county is offering up for sale were free under the Emancipation Proclamation." Um, in fact, and it's totally fair. Like there are all kinds of people who had fled from Alabama and other states who would have been freed under the proclamation. So you can see it cutting both ways, and what I think it's really what again I think it speaks to sort of the multiplicity and the complexity of the stories that we tell about the Civil War.
Well, and you make a great point too. Like as the front lines of emancipation do start moving, you
Hmm.
say those closest to liberty found themselves perversely especially vulnerable to sale and
Yeah.
separation from family and friend. Because even if the slave trade's kind of going on business as usual, as emancipation physically gets closer, we've got to sell our assets and see what sort of
Yeah.
and that must have been a sad sort of response for people, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's really so what's really interesting, and what makes the slave trade so powerful but yet insidious during the Civil War is that what it doesn't matter really if there's local demand for enslaved people, right? What it does is it strengthens slaveholders' hands locally, because as long as there's demand for enslaved people somewhere, as long as they can get people to a market like Richmond, they can sell people to a place where slavery is intact. And so you see in cities throughout the Confederacy, cities behind the lines in protected places, what you see waves of refugees. White refugees often driving in refugeed enslaved people before them, and they bring them to these slave markets. And this you see this in places like Montgomery, Alabama. You see it in Atlanta, in Georgia, and in backcountry slave markets throughout the Confederacy's interior. What you see is that they suddenly fill up with people. Often from the Atlantic seaboard, for example, whom Confederates have moved away from safety and are trying to sell in a place where the Confederacy still holds sway and where slavery is not untouched. I think it would be an oversimplification to say that, but where slavery is still largely intact. And so, if you're an enslaved person, where you are in sort of Northern Virginia, right? You're really close to possible liberation. You're really close to Union lines, but you're also in a particularly precarious spot, because the person who enslaves you could get antsy at any moment and decide the best thing to do is to send you to Richmond and sell you to Alabama. Um, and so again, like what I hope what I want to suggest is that emancipation is an incredibly complicated, incredibly fraught, and incredibly risky process. And so some people enslaved in, again, in, let's say, Northern Virginia, right? Some people respond by fleeing to Union lines immediately before they can be sold. But some people sort of, they look and they say, well, maybe I can make it, but if I can't make it, I'm definitely going to be sold. And it's a real calculus that weighs that enslaved people weigh as they think about how to approach how to approach the opportunities that are proffered for freedom during the war.
When you talk about how complex emancipation is, and as we kind of head into the home stretch here in our conversation, it makes me think of your last chapter where you talk about the ends and afterlives. And I really thought that was really insightful to frame those as plurals, ends, because there's more than one, afterlives, more than
Mhm.
one, and how that really impacts the conception of freedom for African Americans as emancipation kind of unrolls in this really complicated way.
Yeah, and I think about we touched on this, I think, a little bit in our conversation at the beginning, but one of the things that I think historians have done a really good job showing is that um, people coming out of slavery have a very expansive and capacious definition of freedom. Sometimes it's stated narrowly. Was just having a conversation with Bennett Parton about his new book on Sherman's March and Emancipation. And you have this conversation between Sherman and Edwin Stanton and African American ministers in Savannah, where in some cases they're offering sort of precise definitions of freedom as not, not being compelled to work for the benefit of someone else. But you also have these expansive ideas of freedom is is autonomy, it's control over one's time, it's control over one's work, and particularly it's the sanctity and autonomy of one's family. And the slave trade during the war attacks many of those aspects. And like we said earlier, it doesn't the damage it doesn't disappear when the Civil War is over. In many cases, enslaved people work really hard to repair the damage that the wartime slave trade had done, but in many cases, that's just not possible. Despite their best efforts, I spent a lot of time looking at the Freedmen's Bureau, and tracing the ways in which they searched for enslaved people. And the depressing reality is all too often Freedmen's Bureau agents come back and they say, "Yeah, we've asked around, we have worked with the local church, we've posted materials publicly, and we can't find the people that you've asked us to look for." And that lingers. That has a powerful effect long after the war is over.
Yeah. So, Robert, any final thoughts you'd like to impart to our listeners and viewers today?
Well, I think one of the things that I'll just say one of the reasons I wrote this book, and one of the reasons I wrote it in the way it did that I did is I hope that historians and students and people who are interested in the Civil War don't always talk to people who are historians or scholars or uh, enthusiasts or people interested in slavery. And so those two conversations often sort of pass one another or overlap only briefly. And so one of the things that I hope this book does is that it will introduce people who are interested in Civil War, who are deeply familiar with the course of the conflict, with some of its leading figures, that it'll introduce them to what's happening in American slavery, both before and during the Civil War, and that the reverse would be the case as well. The people who primarily study and know about American slavery, but don't know about what the Civil War does or what it means for enslavement, or sort of the ways in which the twists and turns of that conflict affect the ways in which people become free. One of the things I hope this book does is it creates a conversation between those different audiences, and I hope it bridges a gap between people who don't always talk to each other, but probably really should. If you're interested in the Civil War, I hope this book will sort of expand your understanding of American slavery. If you're interested in American slavery, or if you know people who are, I hope this is a good introduction for them to the Civil War, and the questions that people who think a lot about the Civil War ask about it.
And it's written in good, clear, accessible prose. I really enjoyed it as a reading experience. I commend you on bringing this story to light in a way that I think will benefit a lot of different people in a way that they can access really well. The book
Well,
is
thank you.
An
That's very
Unholy
generous.
Traffic. Yeah, yeah. Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Robert, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's been a treat for me as well. So thank you so much. So I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.